Another thing I wanted to ask, which it seems a bit of a riddle to me. So you paint a picture of somewhere like Luton, which is demographically drastically different, and isn't necessarily recognizable as an English town that it might have been 100 years ago or even 80 years ago. But even if you had a moratorium on immigration and there was zero zero gross migration,
Yeah, sure. Or even some net negative.
You've got a town like Luton, and those who are of heritage other than British, who are there, might be administratively British or have become British since, but have these cultures that, as you described earlier in this conversation, are less compatible, and you said not compatible with Britain. What do you do with regards to that in integration and assimilation? Is it the sort of case where I think of the Italians and the Jews in America who really immigrated around 1900. It took about 3 generations for them to really become part of the American fabric. Is it a waiting game?
Yeah, but America was also a new nation. So the story of America is profoundly different from the story of Britain or the story of England or indeed the story of Europe. I mean, so America had to have a very different unifying story, which was essentially if you come here, work hard, you can chase the American dream. We have a very different cultural foundation here, even though our politicians would like us to think we're exactly the same as America. Look, the answer is this. From the 1960s to basically today, we have broadly followed a policy of state-backed multiculturalism. And that policy has been more focused on promoting group differences, promoting the different cultures, traditions, histories, beliefs, cultural practices of minority groups, while downplaying and suppressing or simply ignoring the identity, culture, and traditions of the majority group. So multiculturalism has failed, right? 15 years ago, David Cameron said that. 15 years ago, Nicolas Sarkozy said that. 15 years ago, even Angela Merkel said that. Now,
and that was an attempt, by the way, of the globalists to come up with the unifying...
But the key point in that is exactly that point, which is ever since we've had an open acknowledgement that multiculturalism has failed, when you have homegrown Islamist bombers, when you have the rape gangs, when you have people blowing up children at pop concerts, like it's obviously failed, nobody has had the courage in this country to come forward and say, this is the alternative to multiculturalism. This is a successor policy. This is what's going to follow this failed policy, and this is what's going to get our country in a much better position and make it healthy and strong again. Now, I would argue that that policy has to be some kind of Danish-style active assimilation, right? Whereby you freeze mass uncontrolled immigration for a long period of time so the country can absorb the change that has been unfolding over the last few years. Yes, you do things like deport illegal migrants and foreign criminals. Okay, I don't think people would dispute that. But you then need to put into place an activist interventionist policy of assimilation, like the Danes have done, where you make it clear we're not going to have 1 million people in this country who don't speak English. We're not going to be providing translation services through public institutions. We're not going to have highly segregated schools. We're not going to have a country where, according to people like Ed Hussein and his very important work, if you're a young British Muslim, you can spend your entire day never interacting with a member of the non-Muslim majority. We're not going to have this anymore. We're going to make sure our schools are mixed. We're going to make sure our institutions are prioritizing who we are in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of history. And we are going to actively intervene, a bit like Singapore has done, like Denmark has done, to break down segregation and parallel communities. We're going to also, by the way, come down much tougher on, let's say, things that enable Islamism in this country. No more Sharia courts, no more parallel legal systems, no more cousin marriage. I agree that we should ban cousin marriage in this country. No more radical preaching. If that's going on, then much bigger consequences. Shutting down on the enablers of Islamism, And we need to also look much more seriously at political sectarianism. We should not be having MPs who are spending more time campaigning for airports in Pakistan than are campaigning for issues and interests of British people here on these islands. That's not acceptable.
Okay, so
we can. What I'm saying is, forget multiculturalism. It's failed. We need a full-blown new policy framework that is about active assimilation.
Okay, so I've got a few questions. I'll try and take them one at a time. Singapore, you mentioned them. Now, they are, of course, a democracy, but they're not liberal. And you say they have various policies.
What I meant by that, take a policy like housing.
Yeah.
Singapore, mixed housing.
Mixed housing, but actually it's regulated housing. So each demographic, for each area, there's an assigned amount for each identity to have. That's right. So that's where they disperse. It's forced integration by dispersing people. And if you want to sell your apartment in a building, let's say, when at the end, you have to sell it to someone of the same race as you to maintain the demographics of the area. But that's all well and good for Singapore, and it seems to be working for Singapore because they're a very stable country with very little social issues compared to us, certainly. But it's not liberal. And Britain is a liberal, even conservatives.
It depends what you mean by liberal. I would say having a state that intervenes to correct a housing market that has become a hotbed of segregation and extremism, you could very well argue that is about defending the things that make a liberal society possible to begin with. Because in a situation where most, I can't remember the exact figure, but most Somalis in London are in social housing, it's not good for them. It's not good for the social housing market. And it's certainly not good for the British people who can't get housing in the capital city. That's not working. The fact that in places like Birmingham, Leicester, London, you have in some neighbourhoods, 60-70% of all social housing has gone to people who were not born in the UK, who don't even speak English. We have 300,000 people in London who don't speak English at all, and who don't identify as British or English as well.
Yeah, but
so the social contract is completely broken down. But if you have an activist state that intervenes and said, no, actually, the beginning principle of our housing market is British taxpayers, hard-working citizens who uphold the social contract, they go first, right? If you come to this country, you have to work to become part of this social contract. That's better for everybody. It's better for the people who come to our country, and it's better for the British people who've been paying into the collective pot for many years, if not for generations. We need an interventionist state. That's not about illiberalism. That is about saying the state has to now intervene because multiculturalism has been such a failure.
Yeah, okay, but it's fair enough, and I would support such a policy where you prioritise British people over newcomers.
Yeah, but
but that's not the Singapore model. Sorry, the Singapore model is that it's actively separating groups from each other. So it would be more a natural parallel would be to say, okay, you got somewhere like Birmingham. There's too many of one group, and it's forming a sort of sectarian kind of new zone. You actually have to split these people up. We're going to send a bunch of you over here, a bunch of you over there. That would be the Singapore equivalent.
I wouldn't zoom too much on Singapore. It's what the Danes are doing.
Okay, I don't know the Dane story. You can tell me the Dane story.
So the Danes would say, if there's a ghetto, if there is a no-go area that is dominated by whatever, Islamists, migrant gangs, whatever, the state will intervene, will basically remove that tower block, will intervene in that neighborhood, and will ensure that that scale of segregation is not allowed to carry on. Because Sweden, which took a very different approach, Sweden said, hands off, very liberal, live where you want, do what you want. Well, guess what? Now you've got ongoing bombings in Swedish cities by migrant gangs that have not integrated into the surrounding society. The reason I just said, well, what about universities, is take an example. People said, well, the universities will reform themselves on free speech. And actually they didn't. What the universities did is they chased out people like Kathleen Stock. They chased out people like Eric Kaufmann, and they basically became deeply intolerant institutions. The state had to intervene to level the playing field in the universities by creating the free speech higher education law, something I and others helped to design. In the same way, you can look at many other spheres of British life and say, this is no longer working. We cannot just leave these communities to themselves. We cannot leave these religious institutions to themselves. We cannot leave these cultural policies to themselves. The state will have to intervene in order to protect the social contract and make this nation state viable over the longer term. I don't think that's controversial. I think that is an obvious response to a failed policy. You know, we cannot have communities and neighborhoods in this country where they are not British anymore in any visible, meaningful, serious sense. They are not exhibiting the cultural practices, the rule of law, the belief in individual freedom, in women's rights. They're not. They do not exhibit anything that we would associate as being recognizable on these islands. Now, when that happens, the state has to intervene, including things like, you know, obvious things, symbols of that. Religious clothing, for example, would be something as well that
you want to ban the burqa.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, that's just a no. That's an easy thing for me. It's a no-brainer. I'm with Jack Straw and Labour politicians who have been reasonable on that issue in saying this is not going to build an integrated society. It's also a very visible physical display of misogyny and subordination. We're not having that. That's not part of our culture. And this is what Gareth Jones was saying. When you have mass migration, you have cultural transplant. You have the transplant of beliefs, religious identities and practices that aren't really anything to do with your nation, but they are transplanted in and they cascade down. It's why second, third generation British Muslims are often more radical than their fathers and grandfathers, parents and grandparents.
Burqas aren't part of our culture, correct. I'd actually go further. If you think about the 7/7 bombings and the Islamist attack, Islamist attack
All took
in
the
this
train
country
from Luton, of course.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I would actually say that it's not just not part of our culture, but it's actually, given what we've suffered from Islamism, it's a little bit offensive to hide your face in public. I would say that. However, what is also part of our culture is liberalism. And what we learnt, the religious wars, and we kind of came out of that in the 17th century with religious tolerance in a way that in Europe they didn't have the same sort of thing, which is why there are so many European countries that ban the burqa and have these rules, but they're much more used to the sort of Roman law approach of top-down controlling people. We, the British, have a very different bottom-up common law approach where this would be quite drastic. I think this would be quite. I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong that these are wearing a niqab is obviously not British, but it is also the case that to compel people how to wear goes against our tradition of freedom.
So let me be very, very clear. We are tolerating people who in the end will not tolerate us. That is the underlying point. We are allowing, particularly with Islamic
people or ideas
carried out by people. Islamism, the political ideology, is dogmatic. It's about control. It's about hijacking institutions. And it is about reshaping liberal Western societies around a particular set of illiberal, anti-Western ideas. We just need to be realistic about that. The failure of our political leaders to even be willing to talk about that, the refusal of Labour politicians to say why they were being intimidated, why they were being threatened, why they were being harassed, speaks to the weakness in our political class. It's very obvious what was happening at the last general election in particular parts of the country, like it was very obvious what happened to Sir David Amess and others, that people understandably are scared because they are talking about something that is instinctively dogmatic and it is fundamentalist. So I'm not interested actually in saying, well, we have a liberal tradition of standing back and letting people do whatever they want. No, we have a very specific problem that will require the state to intervene to fix that problem. Otherwise, we will not be a liberal society over the longer term.